Hi everyone, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm really excited to be talking to you about my 5 favourite books of all time. I've got 5 novels here which I think represent the best reading experiences I've ever had in my life. Now, I'm not saying that these are the best books ever written, and you may well disagree. Indeed, you can probably go onto Goodreads and find 1-star reviews for any of these books very easily, but I want to share with you why they're important to me. They're also probably not going to be my favourite books forever and ever, and it'll be really interesting to look back on this video at some point in the future and see how many of my opinions still hold true. I've tried to reflect on what it is that unites these books as my favourites, and I don't think there's any one thing that all of the books do that I could point to and say, that's a Ben book. We've got a mixture of old books and new books, first person and third person, different themes explored, and that makes sense, right? We as humans contain multitudes and our tastes are going to have a number of different facets to them. But I do think there are family resemblances between these books. There must be this pool of underlying things that I really like about fiction, and these books draw on those things in different ways. Some of the things that I've noticed that I do really like are ambition in terms of scope or theme or form. I like really well-drawn characters with complex interior lives. And to be honest, one that surprised me when I was thinking about this was that I love really convincing dialogue. Characters that just talk to each other in believable ways. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with talking about what these books are, which I found surprisingly easy to narrow down as my favourites. And I'm going to talk through them in no particular order, starting with Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. This was published in 1961 and is made up of a short story, Franny, and a novella, Zoe. The short story takes place on a college campus as Franny has lunch with her boyfriend Lane, and while he's caught up in the minutiae of his academic life and the gossip of what's going on, Franny's having a more existential crisis. She sees phoniness everywhere she looks and questions the purpose of everything to the point that she has a bit of a mental breakdown. The novella takes place a few months later. Zoe is Franny's brother, and we see some really interesting sibling dynamics as Zoe is trying to figure out his own stuff while also understanding and supporting his sibling, and it doesn't always quite go to plan. There are probably 3 reasons that I love this book so much. One is just that the prose is delicious. Salinger has such a wonderful turn of phrase that just puts a smile on my face even when the subject matter is heavy. He is an absolute master of this, and I love reading his work. It is such a shame that he only published 4 books. Another reason is that Franny and Zoe are both members of the Glass family. Now, although Salinger's most famous work is The Catcher in the Rye, a lot of his other fiction is concerned with the Glass family, who are this family full of prodigious children who, I think they were brainiacs on some radio show when they were younger, and then many of the stories address their lives when they're a bit older. There's a bit of a virtuous circle in reading his stories, in that the more you read about these characters and the more you see things from different perspectives, the more complex and real they seem, and the more invested you are in them, and the more you get out of the fiction in general. In a way, he's the OG cinematic universe guy. Finally, I think a lot of the fondness I have for this book is based on the time in my life and the place that I read it. I have very vivid memories having just finished my finals and sitting out on the lawn in the sunshine, free from the shackles of university exams, reading this book, and it just speaking to me in a way that a book hadn't up until then. As I was approaching the transition from university life into quote-unquote the real world, I could kind of relate to Franny's existential worries and the phoniness she saw all around her. And the things I felt while I read this book have stuck with me to this day. I just have such wonderful memories of having read it. The next book that is one of my faves is Bewilderment by Richard Powers. I published a review of the Overstory not that long ago, where I called it a masterpiece, but I read this book first and I think it's even better. This tells the story of a scientist who searches for exoplanets, which are just Earth-like planets outside of our solar system, called Theo, and his son Robin, or Robbie, who are both dealing with the loss of Theo's wife and Robbie's mother. They both love the outdoors and they go camping and they look up at the stars, and Theo tells these fantastical stories to Robbie about what might be out on those planets that he's searching for. But Robbie's behaviour is getting a lot worse since his mother's death, and Theo seeks out this cutting-edge therapy whereby Robbie's brain is scanned and he tries to recreate the states of other scanned brains in a more calm state. I don't think that therapy is real, but the science of it seems very convincing in the book. And while Robbie's behaviour improves, he does become very emboldened and concerned about climate change and embarks on a bit of a personal mission. This book is not very long, it's nowhere near as long as the Overstory, but it is just absolutely beautiful. It's a very touching story of a father and son, and it really just broke my heart. I really loved it. There were points where, yes, I cried. It made me very sad. But Powers is an absolutely wonderful writer. He's a deep thinker. He deeply researches the things that he writes about. And I can't imagine someone picking up this book and not loving it. It is just glorious. The next book is another one that's been fairly recently published, and that is Love and Other Thought Experiments by Sophie Ward. It's billed as a collection of short stories, but I think it's got a much stronger narrative through line than that suggests. We follow Rachel and Eliza, who at the start of the first story are in bed, kind of debating what they're going to do about trying to have a child, when Rachel thinks that an ant gets into her eye. Eliza is clearly sceptical, but she has a choice to make. Does she just believe Rachel and support her, or does she push and try and find the truth? What follows is the fallout of that seemingly innocuous decision that Eliza has to make. There is, however, a conceit in the structure of this book that I think really elevates it and makes it much more interesting than just a straightforward story of a relationship. And that's that each chapter starts with and introduces a thought experiment. Now, if you're not sure what a thought experiment is, it's just a hypothetical scenario that philosophers or scientists may use to try and think through the consequences of that situation and maybe the pre-existing beliefs we have around it that would determine what happens in that situation. A good example of a thought experiment, and one that is used in the book, is the ship of Theseus. And it asks, if you replace parts of a ship over time, at what point does that ship stop being the original ship? And if you take all the parts that you removed and build a new ship from that, which one has the better claim to being the original ship of Theseus? There are no right or wrong answers to questions like this. It's not a riddle, it's more of a thinking device. And Sophie Ward uses these to sort of power each of these chapters thematically. Not all of the links are obvious, and some of them may be a little bit tenuous, but it is fun to try and think about how the plot reflects or embodies the thought experiment that the chapter opened with. The second chapter in this book really stands out for me, and that centres around the prisoner's dilemma game from economic game theory. And it plays out a scenario multiple times based on whether the two characters at the centre of this story cooperate or defect. And not only does it just work as a story that it's really interesting to see how these scenarios play out, but it also ties really brilliantly back to the prisoner's dilemma. And then by the end of the book, it takes on new meaning when you find out what is actually going on in the story. I thought it was an absolute masterclass. And the story of this book, to be honest, is deceptively simple. It seems like a quiet relationship drama at the start, but I should say that it grows into something altogether more ambitious and quite sci-fi tinged, and I thought that was just really, really brilliantly done. This book does have a lot of big brain energy, and it will leave you scratching your head at times and trying to work out what is actually going on. But at the same time, it's filled with a cast of believable and well-written characters. Sophie Ward is primarily an actress, and I think that really comes through in the dialogue and the character dynamics. It is simply but beautifully written, and I really love this book. Next is a book that I don't think I actually would have read of my own volition, but it was recommended to me by a colleague, and we did a bit of a buddy read of it. And that is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Kesey. This story is told from the perspective of Chief Bromden, a silent Native American man in a psychiatric hospital, who describes the chaos caused by the arrival of McMurphy, who has faked insanity in order to escape a prison sentence. For me, this book was a masterclass in sustained metaphor. The repeated use of the image of the combine, of everything being a connected, unrelenting machine, was so powerful. Not only was it threaded into the prose really effectively throughout the book, but it recognised the societal systems that conspire to keep these people locked away and outside of society. It has the iconic Nurse Ratched, it added the phrase bull goose loony to my vocabulary, and it's another one that really just broke my heart at the end. This edition in particular is really cool because Kesey actually worked in a mental hospital. What we get included are his sketches of his time in those hospitals, which adds another really interesting layer. These drawings don't just reflect sort of visualizing what's there, but they really add quite a lot of emotion. They're drawn in quite an emotive way. So I really liked those popping up throughout my reading of this book. Okay, last but not least is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Yes, this book. Yes, I did feel sad while reading it. And yes, I know that some people hate it and it's gone through a little bit of a backlash of sorts in recent years. But for me, this was a reading experience like no other. Following these four characters, and particularly centering on Jude over the 40 years that the novel is set, was just so deeply immersive, and I felt like I was reading about real people. A lot of that comes down to the sheer quality of Hanya Yanagihara's prose, which is just stunning. This is a 700-page book, and I could have easily read another 300 pages of it. I was just transported to New York and to these lives. There are, of course, points where the suffering gets a little bit ridiculous, and I had to pause for thought recently when someone who had read it told me that it really changed the way they thought about mental health, despite the fact that Hanya Yanagihara had admitted that she did no research into that aspect of the novel. This is not a book to learn from, but a book to be absorbed by. And for me, this was an intense and rewarding reading experience that I will never forget. And so I love this book. So those are my 5 favourite books ever. Well, at least as of right now. And I'm really interested to know if you've got any recommendations based on these of books you think I'll love. Let me know in the comments, and also let me know what your favourite books of all time are. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more of my content, why not hit the subscribe button? And until next time, toodles!